The city was a river of fractured light, each headlight and neon sign bleeding into the rain-slicked glass of the bus window. Elara Vance, 22, rested her forehead against the cool surface, watching the world dissolve into abstract streaks of color. It was a fitting metaphor for her own life, a series of moments that were vibrant from a distance but lacked coherent shape up close. She was a ghost in her own narrative, a student of child psychology who understood the intricate mechanics of the human heart, but had never allowed anyone to truly examine her own. A deep, quiet emptiness resided within her, a space she had carefully guarded since leaving her small town. Her virginity was not a shield born of fear or faith, but a locked room for which she had yet to find the key, convinced that true intimacy was a language she hadn't yet heard spoken. If you want to discover the man who holds the key to that locked room, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. This deeply held belief about intimacy had shaped her solitary existence. For Elara, the physical act was the final, resonant chord of a symphony, not the chaotic tuning of instruments. She had witnessed the transactional nature of connection in the world around her, relationships built on convenience, fleeting attraction, or the simple fear of being alone. She had felt the clumsy press of hands that sought to take without understanding, heard the hollow compliments from mouths that spoke without listening. Each time, she had retreated further into herself, not out of prudishness, but from a profound sense of self-preservation. She was waiting for a connection that felt like a homecoming, a silent understanding that would make the surrender of her body a natural extension of the surrender of her soul, and she was beginning to fear she was waiting for a myth. Her past was a carefully curated landscape of muted tones, a life she had purposefully fled. She could still feel the suffocating weight of her provincial hometown, a place where futures were pre-written and passion was a teenage folly to be outgrown. Her family, pragmatic to a fault, had mapped out her existence. A sensible marriage to a local boy with steady prospects, a life of predictable comfort, devoid of grand emotions or messy desires. Their love was a thing of duty and provision, not of poetry. Elara's quiet rebellion wasn't a fiery explosion, but a silent escape in the dead of night, a bus ticket to the metropolis bought with saved-up wages, a choice to embrace uncertainty over the slow, crushing death of a life that was not her own. The guilt of that departure was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her days. Now her world was a tiny, fourth-floor walk-up apartment that always smelled faintly of her downstairs neighbor's cooking and old books. It was her sanctuary and her self-imposed prison. The city sprawled beneath her window, a glittering, indifferent beast promising everything and nothing at all. Here, she was anonymous, a student poring over theories of attachment and childhood trauma, finding a strange solace in understanding the wounds of others, while her own remained unexamined. Her days were a disciplined cycle of lectures, library hours, and part-time shifts at a coffee shop, where she learned the orders of 100 strangers, but knew the names of none. This life was the price of her freedom, a solitary, modest existence that kept the world at arm's length, protecting the fragile, idealistic core of who she hoped to one day become. But the silence in her apartment often grew too loud, amplifying the hollow space within her. It was an ache that textbooks and lukewarm coffee could not fill. At night, she would trace the patterns of light on her ceiling, feeling like an observer of life rather than a participant. She craved a connection that was more than theoretical, a real-world application for the empathy that swelled within her. She longed to pour her quiet strength into something, or someone, that was broken, to see if her gentle patience could actually mend a fracture in the real world. This yearning was becoming a desperate, unspoken prayer, a plea to the indifferent city for a purpose that felt more significant than simply surviving on the margins of her own story, a story that felt as if it had yet to truly begin. The advertisement appeared on the university job board, a sterile block of text that felt jarringly out of place among requests for research assistants and campus tour guides. Live-in nanny and developmental aid sought for a 5-year-old boy. High-profile private residence, discretion and professionalism paramount. It was the final line that caught her breath. Candidate must have a background in child psychology with a focus on nonverbal trauma. It wasn't just a job. It was a case study, a challenge thrown down from a world of unimaginable wealth and privilege. The anonymity of the listing. No names, just a corporate contact at a firm called Blackwood Holdings, only added to its mystique. It felt like a door creaking open into a life far removed from her own, promising a glimpse into a gilded cage. A strange resolve settled over her as she drafted her application. This was not a choice born of naivete. She understood the chasm that separated her world of student loans and instant noodles from the one implied by high-profile and private residence. But the alternative was to remain here, safe in her cocoon of academic theory, forever wondering. The boy, silent and 5 years old, called to the deepest part of her, the part that studied pain in order to heal it. She saw in him a reflection of her own guarded silence. Applying for the position was an act of profound, terrifying hope. It was a step out of the audience and onto the stage, a decision to stop observing life and finally risk living it, whatever the cost to her carefully protected heart. The sharp, insistent buzz of her phone cut through the quiet hum of her tiny refrigerator, a summons from a world she had tried to leave behind. It was her mother. Alara watched the name flash on the screen, a familiar knot tightening in her stomach. Answering was an act of filial duty that felt like a concession. Her mother's voice, warm yet edged with a persistent worry that always sounded like judgment, filled the small apartment. The conversation followed its usual, well-worn path. Gentle inquiries about her studies that were really questions about her future, followed by a casual mention of Michael, the boy from back home who had just been promoted at the local bank. Every word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall of expectation around Alara, a reminder of the sensible, secure life she had so recklessly abandoned for this lonely, uncertain freedom. Michael was the ghost of a future she didn't want. She could picture him perfectly, his kind, predictable smile, the way he would have held her hand with a comfortable but uninspiring possessiveness, their life unfolding in a series of pre-approved milestones. A mortgage on a house 2 streets down from her parents, 2 children by 30, a shared retirement account. He was the embodiment of safety, the personification of her hometown's highest ideal. Marrying him would have been like closing a book before the most interesting chapter began. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the draft from her old window. It was the terror of a quiet life, of a soul slowly suffocating under the weight of contentment. Her rejection of him wasn't a rejection of a man, but of a destiny that felt like a beautifully decorated cage. The pressure wasn't just emotional, it was a tangible weight in the form of digits on a screen. After the call, Alara opened her laptop, the glow illuminating her anxious face. The student loan portal was a landscape of stark, unforgiving numbers, a debt that grew with silent, compounding interest. It was a chain linking her to a system that demanded she be practical, that she find a career that would justify the expense. Her study of child psychology, a passion she pursued with academic fervor, felt like an indulgence in this light. The loan was a constant, low-grade hum of panic in the back of her mind, a reminder that her freedom was conditional, rented on borrowed time and money. Every dollar spent on groceries, every textbook purchased, was measured against that looming astronomical figure, reinforcing the feeling that she was one misstep away from failure. Her sister, Lily, was the living embodiment of the life Alara had rejected. A quick scroll through social media confirmed it. A new album of photos showed Lily flashing a modest diamond ring, her arm linked with a man who looked like a younger version of their father. The caption was a nauseatingly sweet ode to finding my forever. Friends and relatives filled the comments with congratulations and heart emojis, a digital chorus of approval for a choice so conventional it felt like a performance. Alara felt a toxic mix of emotions, a pang of genuine happiness for her sister, overshadowed by a wave of suffocating claustrophobia and a flicker of bitter envy. Lily had chosen the mapped-out road, and while Alara pitied the lack of adventure, she couldn't deny the painful allure of its certainty and the community's warm embrace. Her part-time job was a daily lesson in anonymity and quiet desperation. At the daily grind, she was a pair of hands, an automaton efficiently processing orders for caffeine-starved city dwellers. She learned their complicated preferences, extra foam, half sweet, a whisper of cinnamon, but their faces blurred into a single impatient mass. Her boss, a man whose smiles never reached his eyes, monitored her every move, his presence a constant reminder of her precarious financial state. The work was repetitive, the pay was barely enough to cover her rent, and the forced politeness chipped away at her spirit. It was here, surrounded by the hiss of the espresso machine and the clatter of ceramic, that the immense, crushing indifference of the city felt most acute. She was a tiny, replaceable cog in a massive, uncaring machine. The values of her upbringing were etched into her psyche like scripture. She remembered her father, a man of calloused hands and few words, explaining his philosophy of love over a chipped kitchen table. "Love isn't poetry, Ilara," he had said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "It's a sturdy roof in a storm. It's knowing there's food in the pantry and the bills are paid. Butterflies don't keep you warm in the winter." This pragmatism was the bedrock of her family's world, a belief system forged from generations of hardship. Emotions were a luxury, passion, a dangerous fire that could burn a sensible life to the ground. Her own deeply held, romantic ideals felt like a foreign language in the house she grew up in, a secret, shameful indulgence she had to hide, lest it be dismissed as childish fantasy. This ingrained sense of duty was a constant internal battle. She felt the weight of her parents' unspoken sacrifices, the extra shifts her father worked, the small luxuries her mother went without, all to give her a chance they never had. Even though they disapproved of her path, the guilt of their investment was a heavy cloak she could never shrug off. It manifested in small, self-punishing ways. She would stand in a department store, her hand hovering over a new coat she desperately needed, only to retreat, the image of her mother's worn-out sewing machine flashing in her mind. This sense of moral debt kept her tethered to their expectations, making her quiet rebellion feel less like a triumphant escape and more like a selfish betrayal she had to continually justify to herself. The city, once a symbol of liberation, had revealed its more oppressive side. The towering skyscrapers that had once seemed to promise limitless possibility now felt like colossal tombstones, casting long, cold shadows over the streets. The relentless noise, the crush of bodies on the subway, the sheer, overwhelming scale of it all served to amplify her own insignificance. It was a different kind of prison from her hometown, one made of concrete and steel instead of gossip and expectation, but a prison nonetheless. Here, she wasn't trapped by knowing everyone. She was trapped by knowing no one. The anonymity she had craved had curdled into a profound loneliness, a feeling of being utterly adrift in a vast, churning ocean of humanity that would not notice if she simply disappeared beneath the waves. The expectation of marriage, of settling down, was the most suffocating pressure of all. It wasn't just her mother's phone calls. It was a cultural undercurrent she had been swimming against her whole life. In her hometown, a woman of 22 who was unattached and pursuing a graduate degree was an anomaly, a problem to be solved. Her virginity, a conscious choice to wait for a connection of immense depth, was viewed through a lens of pity or suspicion. Was she too picky? Too strange? Frightened? This external judgment slowly eroded her confidence, making her wonder if her own standards were a form of self-sabotage, a romantic delusion that would leave her permanently isolated. The world seemed to be screaming at her to compromise, to settle for good enough before she was left with nothing at all. As she attached her resume to the application for the Blackwood position, all these forces converged within her. The sterile corporate language of the job description felt like a portal to another universe, one far removed from her mother's worries and the judgmental eyes of her past. This wasn't just about paying off her loans or gaining professional experience. It was a desperate bid for a different kind of life. A chance to prove that her skills, her empathy, had value in a world that measured worth in dollars and marriage certificates. The penthouse, with its promise of a silent, wounded child, seemed less like a gilded cage and more like a potential sanctuary. It was an opportunity to step into a narrative so profoundly different from her own that it might just grant her the one thing she truly craved, a complete and total escape. The address led to a monolithic tower of black glass and steel that pierced the clouds, a structure that didn't just occupy a space in the skyline but owned it. An assistant with a practiced, impersonal smile escorted Ilara into a private elevator that ascended with a silent, stomach-dropping swiftness. The doors opened directly into the penthouse, and the sheer scale of the space stole her breath. It was less a home and more a curated gallery of emptiness. Walls of glass revealed a panoramic, godlike view of the city below. The furniture was sparse, architectural, and rendered in shades of gray, black, and chrome. Every surface gleamed with a sterile perfection. There were no photographs, no clutter, no sign of life. Only a profound, echoing silence that was more intimidating than any noise. It was the immaculate mausoleum of a man who had declared war on warmth and memory. Left alone in the cavernous living area, Alara felt like a trespasser, a splash of soft, uncertain color in a stark black and white photograph. She clasped her hands together to stop them from trembling, her worn coat feeling impossibly shabby against the Italian leather of the sofa she dared not sit on. Her gaze drifted across the room, cataloging the subtle signs of immense, unfeeling wealth. A massive abstract painting that was a storm of angry black strokes, a grand piano so polished it looked like a block of solid night. On a side table, a single silver picture frame was turned away, its back to the room, a deliberate and poignant act of erasure. The air was cool and still, filtered and recycled, carrying no scent of food or life. It was the atmosphere of a place where people didn't live, but merely existed. He appeared without a sound, a phantom in his own home. One moment she was alone, and the next, Julian Blackwood was standing by the far window, his silhouette a sharp cutout against the sprawling city lights. He moved with a predatory grace, his dark bespoke suit fitting him like a second skin, a piece of modern armor. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, handsome in a way that was more intimidating than attractive. His dark hair was meticulously styled, and his posture was one of absolute, unshakable control. He didn't seem to breathe the same air as she did. He seemed to command it, to bend it to his will. His presence was not a greeting, but an occupation, a force that immediately diminished everything else in the room, including her. When he finally turned, his eyes met hers across the vast expanse of polished marble. They were a startling, pale gray, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, and they held a chilling intelligence. His gaze was not a look, but an assessment, a swift, dispassionate scan that took in her nervous posture, her simple dress, her earnest expression, and filed it all away without comment. Ilara felt a profound shiver trace its way down her spine, a strange and unsettling mix of pure intimidation and a deeply buried, unwelcome flicker of fascination. In that single, silent moment, she understood that this man did not engage with the world. He analyzed it for weaknesses. She was a problem to be solved, a variable to be controlled, nothing more. His voice, when he finally spoke, was exactly as she had imagined, a low, resonant baritone, smooth as polished stone and just as cold. He held a tablet in one hand, not even offering her the courtesy of his full attention. Alara Vance, he began, the words clipped and precise, devoid of any social pleasantry. Graduate studies in child psychology, focus on developmental trauma. You come highly recommended by your department head. He recited the facts of her life as if they were line items on a corporate acquisition report. He didn't ask her to confirm them. He stated them, establishing his authority, making it clear that he already knew everything he needed to know. The interview felt less like a conversation and more like a final, perfunctory inspection of a newly purchased asset. Summoning a strength she didn't know she possessed, Ilara met his gaze directly, refusing to be reduced to a list of qualifications. My focus is on nonverbal communication in children who have experienced loss, she clarified, her voice steadier than she expected. I believe that silence is a language, not just an absence of sound. It requires patience and empathy to translate. She watched him for a reaction, for any sign that her words had registered on a human level. He remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, but she saw the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his grip on the tablet. He never referred to his son by name, using clinical terms like the child or the situation, a deliberate distancing that spoke volumes about his own unresolved pain. She decided to press forward, driven by a sudden, inexplicable need to pierce his armor. A child's environment is crucial, she continued, her voice softening. They need more than just a routine. They need to feel the presence of consistent, gentle care. They need to know they aren't alone in their grief. At the word grief, it happened, a minute, almost invisible flinch. A muscle in his jaw clenched for a fraction of a second, and his storm-gray eyes darkened with a shadow so profound it seemed to pull all the light from the room. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, his mask of cold indifference snapping back into place, but Ilara had seen it. It was the first evidence of the man drowning beneath the surface of the billionaire. Without acknowledging her comment, he turned. "Follow me." It was an order, not an invitation. He led her through a long, white corridor that felt more like a hospital wing than a hallway. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft click of her sensible shoes against the marble and the sharper, more authoritative sound of his leather-soled dress shoes. "Your duties are exclusively related to my son," he stated, his back to her. "You will adhere to the schedule provided. Your personal life will not interfere with your professional responsibilities. Discretion is not a suggestion, it is a condition of your employment." He was drawing boundaries with the precision of a surgeon, creating a sterile field around his life, his son, and his pain, with her placed firmly on the outside. He stopped before a set of double doors and pushed one open, revealing a playroom of breathtaking extravagance. It was filled with every imaginable toy, all neatly arranged on pristine white shelves, looking more like a high-end store display than a space for a child to play. In the center of a soft gray rug, a small boy with dark hair sat with his back to them, meticulously stacking a tower of wooden blocks. He didn't look up, didn't make a sound. Julian remained in the doorway, a silent, detached observer. He made no move to comfort his son, to introduce Alara, to bridge the devastating silence that filled the room. Alara's heart fractured at the sight. Two figures, father and son, marooned on separate islands of sorrow in the same empty ocean of a home. Ignoring Julian completely, Alara slowly walked into the room and sank to her knees, a respectful distance from the boy Leo. She didn't speak his name or try to engage him. She simply watched, her presence a quiet offering, not a demand. She saw the intense concentration on his small face, the way his hands were steady, creating order in his small corner of a chaotic world. From the doorway, Julian watched her. He saw her respect for his son's silence, her intuitive understanding that the way into Leo's world was not through force, but through stillness. A silent, unacknowledged current passed between the three of them. In that moment, her empathy had answered the one question his cold interrogation never could. She had the job. And in that silent, shared understanding, the first, most dangerous thread of connection was woven between her and the broken man in the doorway. The weeks bled into a quiet, predictable rhythm, a fragile domesticity constructed within the sterile walls of the penthouse. Alara's world shrank to the dimensions of Leo's needs, a universe of picture books, soft-edged wooden toys, and the patient art of listening to silence. She discovered that Leo's grief was not a void but a landscape. It had textures, colors, and a language all its own, spoken in the meticulous arrangement of his blocks, or the fierce, possessive way he clutched a small, worn, stuffed bear. She moved through this world with a reverent quiet, her presence a gentle, constant warmth in the vast, cold apartment. She was succeeding, not in making him speak, but in making his silence feel safe. Julian remained a peripheral figure, a ghost in a tailored suit, who materialized in the evenings and disappeared before dawn, his presence marked only by the scent of expensive cologne and the low hum of his office electronics. The first significant tremor in their carefully balanced world came in the form of a crayon drawing. Alara had been encouraging Leo to express himself through art, and one afternoon he presented her with a piece of paper. On it were three figures, rendered in the shaky, earnest lines of a 5-year-old. A small boy in the middle, a woman with soft, wavy brown hair on one side, and on the other, a tall, dark stick figure. It was the first time he had included anyone besides himself in his world. Alara felt a wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy. It was a map of his healing heart, and she was on it. She carefully taped the drawing to the gleaming, stainless steel refrigerator, a defiant splash of childish color in Julian's monochromatic kitchen, a small, brave flag planted in conquered territory. That evening, she found Julian standing before the refrigerator, his back to her, perfectly still. He wasn't looking at the drawing with paternal pride, but with a kind of pained, analytical intensity, as if it were a complex equation he couldn't solve. He didn't turn when she entered the kitchen, his focus absolute. His mother was the artist, he said, his voice a low murmur, devoid of its usual sharp edge. She could find the soul of a thing with a few strokes of charcoal. It was the most personal detail he had ever offered. A tiny, invaluable shard of his shattered past. Ilara stood frozen a few feet away, feeling the immense weight of the confidence. Understanding that he wasn't just talking about a drawing, he was talking about the ghost who haunted every empty room in their lives. She found her voice, keeping it soft, respectful of the hallowed ground he had just opened. "He has her gift, then," she whispered. "He's learning to show people the world inside him." Julian finally turned, and the look in his storm-gray eyes was raw, unguarded. For a fleeting second, the billionaire was gone, replaced by a man drowning in an ocean of memory. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his gaze she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. Not gratitude, not kindness, but a kind of desperate, grudging acknowledgement. He saw that she understood. This shared moment of insight, of seeing the same wound from different angles, was more intimate than any touch, a silent pact formed over the crayon drawing of a grieving boy. The tension, now given a name and a shape, began to coil in the air between them. It lived in the small, unspoken moments that punctuated their days. It was in the way he would pause in the doorway of the playroom, his attention caught by the sound of Ilara's soft laughter as she and Leo built a fortress of pillows. It was in the way her hand would hover over the coffee maker in the morning, wondering if she should make a second cup for him, a gesture that felt dangerously domestic. They were two satellites, locked in a strange, silent orbit, around a small, sad star, their paths drawing inexorably closer. Ilara felt the shift deep within herself, a subtle recalibration of her own heart. She was no longer just an employee. She was a witness, a confidant, a keeper of secrets spoken and unspoken. One night, unable to sleep, she padded into the kitchen for a glass of water. The cavernous living area was dark, except for the cool blue glow of a laptop screen, illuminating Julian's exhausted face as he hunched over the massive stone island. He looked utterly depleted, the armor of his corporate persona stripped away by fatigue, leaving only the bone-deep weariness of a man fighting a war on too many fronts. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his focus absolute. As she reached for a glass in the cabinet above him, her sleeve brushed against his shoulder. The contact was feather-light, accidental, but it sent a jolt of pure electricity through her body. He flinched, not in anger, but in surprise, as if he'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and dark in the gloom. The air crackled with a sudden, unbearable intensity. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back up to her eyes, a silent confession of a thought he would never dare to speak. She could smell the faint scent of whiskey on his breath, mingled with the clean, sharp scent of his soap. The entire universe seemed to shrink to the few inches of charged air between them. She should have pulled away, apologized, retreated to the safety of her room. Instead, she remained frozen, caught in the tractor beam of his desolate gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that this was more than an accident. It was a consequence. He broke the spell first, turning back to his laptop with a sharp, dismissive motion, the mask of indifference slamming back into place. "My apologies," he murmured, the words clipped and formal, a brutal severing of the fragile thread that had just formed. Ilara retreated without a word, her hand trembling as she clutched the cool glass of water. Back in her room, she leaned against the door, her body thrumming with a strange, terrifying energy. It was desire, raw and undeniable, but it was tangled with something deeper and far more dangerous, a profound, aching empathy for his loneliness. She was beginning to crave the very thing she had spent her life avoiding, a connection that was messy, complicated, and born from pain. The thought terrified her. The late-night encounters became a recurring theme, a dangerous ritual. She would find him working, a solitary king in his glass tower, and she would make him a cup of tea, her presence a quiet, insistent offering of care he never asked for but no longer refused. During one of these silent vigils, she found the courage to speak. "You can't pour from an empty cup, Julian," she said softly, placing the mug on a coaster beside his keyboard. "Leo needs you whole, not just present." He stiffened, his fingers freezing over the keys. It was a direct, personal challenge, a breach of the unspoken rule that his well-being was off-limits. He looked at her, his jaw tight, a storm brewing in his eyes. and she braced herself for the icy dismissal she was sure would follow. But it never came. Instead, the anger in his eyes slowly dissolved, replaced by a look of such profound exhaustion that it made her own chest ache in sympathy. "Wholeness is a luxury I can no longer afford," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. The admission was a surrender, a white flag raised in the dead of night. In that moment he wasn't her employer, and she wasn't his son's nanny. They were just two lonely people, stranded in the quiet hours, speaking a truth that the daylight would never permit. She understood then that his coldness wasn't a weapon. It was a shield, and it was beginning to crack. And she, with her quiet persistence and gentle empathy, was the one holding the hammer. This realization sent a wave of panic through her. Her carefully constructed world, built on principles of emotional clarity and self-preservation, was beginning to crumble. The man she was beginning to feel this terrifying pull towards was the antithesis of everything she thought she wanted. He was not a gentle soul, with whom she could build a symphony of connection. He was a black hole of grief, a man who might consume her light and give nothing back. She was a healer, a student of the human heart. But she had never anticipated that her own heart would become the subject of such a dangerous, unethical experiment. Lying in bed at night, she would trace the patterns of the city lights on her ceiling and feel an agonizing conflict tear through her. Her mind screamed at her to run, to protect herself. This was her job, a means to an end, a way to pay her student loans and gain experience. Getting involved with Julian Blackwood was a catastrophic mistake, a violation of every professional and personal boundary she had ever set. It would compromise her work with Leo, her career, and the very core of her identity. She had fled a life of predictable entrapment, only to find herself willingly walking towards a far more complex and devastating cage, one gilded with wealth and sorrow. Her virginity, once a symbol of her romantic idealism, now felt like a fragile, foolish shield against a force of nature she was powerless to resist. She was on the verge of surrendering her most protected self to a man who didn't even know how to ask for it. Yet, her heart argued with a quiet, stubborn insistence. It reminded her of the flicker of life she saw in his eyes when Leo laughed, of the devastating vulnerability in his voice when he spoke of his late wife, of the desperate, unspoken plea for connection she saw in him during those late, silent nights. To walk away now would feel like an act of profound abandonment, not just of him and Leo, but of the very empathy that defined her. It was a choice between the woman she had always planned to be and the woman this broken family was compelling her to become. The safety of her old beliefs felt like a cold, empty room compared to the terrifying, vibrant warmth that was beginning to bloom in the presence of Julian Blackwood. The dilemma was a constant, low-grade fever, coloring her every interaction. When she looked at Julian now, she no longer saw just a powerful, intimidating employer. She saw the fragile architecture of his pain, the immense effort it took for him to simply exist from one day to the next. Her desire for him was inextricably linked to her desire to heal him, a dangerous and potent cocktail of passion and compassion. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that giving in to this feeling would not be the gentle, poetic unfolding she had always dreamed of. It would be a cataclysm, an event from which she might not recover. She was losing control of her own narrative, her own carefully guarded heart. The air in the penthouse grew heavier, thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Every shared glance was freighted with meaning. Every accidental touch was a small explosion. They were moving towards an inevitable collision, and the force of it was building with each passing day. Elara saw the toll it was taking on Julian. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. His movements became more rigid, as if he were holding himself together by sheer force of will. He was a man stretched to his breaking point, and she was becoming the focal point of all his repressed grief, his loneliness, and his long dormant desire. She felt like she was standing on a cliff's edge, the wind of an approaching storm whipping at her clothes. One evening he came home later than usual, his tie loosened, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. He didn't go to his office but stood in the middle of the living room, staring out at the city lights, as if he didn't recognize them. He looked lost, a king exiled in his own kingdom. When he finally turned and saw her standing in the hallway, his expression was one of complete, unadulterated desperation. He didn't speak, but his eyes held a silent, agonizing plea. It was a look that bypassed all her defenses, all her rational fears, and spoke directly to the most vulnerable part of her soul. In that moment she knew she was past the point of no return. She understood with a terrifying clarity that her choice had already been made. The battle between her head and her heart was over, and her heart, with its reckless, compassionate, and overwhelming capacity for love, had won. She could no longer separate her duty to the child from her feelings for the father. They were a single, intertwined entity, a fractured family she had been drawn into not by chance, but by some deeper, more resonant emotional gravity. Whatever happened next, whatever the cost to her future, her reputation, or her carefully guarded self, she would not abandon them. She would stay. She would face the storm. And as she looked at the broken man across the room, she felt not fear, but a profound, earth-shattering sense of purpose. The silence that followed the lawyer's departure was a weapon. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of cold that Julian pulled around himself, more impenetrable than any fortress wall. He stood by the panoramic window, his back a rigid line of defiance against the city he owned. The accusations from his in-laws that she was an opportunist, a seductress preying on his grief, hung in the air between them, ugly and poisonous. Lara felt them like physical blows. She had been dissected, vilified, and reduced to a caricature of a gold digger. And Julian's response was not to defend her, but to retreat into this Arctic stillness. It was a strategic withdrawal designed to protect his son, but it felt like a brutal, personal amputation, severing the fragile connection they had so painstakingly built in the quiet hours of the night. He moved to his office without a word, the soft click of the closing door sounding as final as a tomb being sealed. Through the frosted glass panels, she could see his silhouette, a dark, motionless shape in the artificial twilight of his workspace. He was erasing her, methodically shutting down every channel of warmth and intimacy she had opened. The crayon drawing was gone from the refrigerator. The mug she used to bring him tea sat cold and empty on the kitchen counter. He was stripping their shared spaces of her influence, reverting the penthouse back to its original state, a sterile, lifeless gallery of grief. Ilara stood in the cavernous living room, feeling the chasm between them widen from a few feet into an uncrossable, desolate canyon. His silence was not an absence of noise. It was a declaration of war on the hope she had brought into his home. A different kind of resolve began to burn through her fear and humiliation. This was the true transgression. Not the late-night conversations or the accidental touches, but the decision she made in that moment. To walk away now would be to validate the lawyer's lies, to accept the role of the defeated employee. More than that, it would be to abandon the man she had seen glimpses of beneath the armor. She would not let him drown in this self-imposed isolation. Her footsteps were unnaturally loud on the polished marble as she crossed the room, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the crushing silence. She was no longer his son's nanny or a line item on his household budget. She was the sole witness to his pain, and she would not be dismissed. She found him exactly where she knew he would be, a sentinel of sorrow staring out at the indifferent city lights. He didn't turn as she entered his office, the scent of leather and ozone filling her senses. "You should be packing, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, chilling monotone. The use of her formal name was a deliberate, cruel strike, an attempt to force her back into the box of her employment, to remind her of the boundaries she was now shattering. "The severance is generous. It will be wired in the morning." He was trying to transact his way out of an emotional crisis, reducing her, their connection, to a final, clean financial settlement. He was treating a wound with a balance sheet, and the sheer, desperate futility of it broke her heart. "They were wrong about you," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering, cutting through his cold pronouncements. He finally turned, his face a mask of controlled fury, but she pressed on before he could speak. "They see a broken man, the victim. I don't. I see a man who gets up every single day and fights a war no one else can see. I see the man who taught his son how to tie his shoes even when his own world was unraveling. I see the person who works until he collapses, not for the money, but to build a fortress around the one thing he has left to love. They don't know you, Julian. But I do." Her words were not an accusation or a plea. They were a statement of fact, an anchor of truth in a sea of lies. A tremor went through him, a violent, uncontrollable shudder that started in his hands and radiated through his entire body. The mask of the cold CEO, the grieving widower, the ruthless billionaire, didn't just crack. It disintegrated. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the full, terrifying magnitude of his agony. His storm-gray eyes were flooded with a pain so profound it was almost sublime, a maelstrom of grief, rage, and a desperate, starving loneliness. He took a single ragged breath, the sound of a man who had been holding it for 2 long years. The carefully constructed walls of his self-control crumbled to dust, leaving him utterly exposed, defenseless before the one person who refused to look away from the wreckage of his soul. He crossed the space between them in 2 long, desperate strides, his movements stripped of their usual predatory grace, replaced by a raw human urgency. It was the movement of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. The world narrowed for Ilara, shrinking to the scent of his cologne, the heat radiating from his body, the sound of his harsh, unsteady breathing. He stopped just before her, his chest rising and falling erratically, his gaze locked on hers. He was searching her face for something. Absolution, permission, a reason to believe her words were true. In her eyes, he found no pity, no fear, only the steadfast, unwavering belief she had just professed. It was the final anchor he needed to let go of the control that was killing him. His mouth came down on hers in a collision, a desperate, claiming act that was less a kiss and more a confession. It was raw, hungry, and filled with the anguish of 1,000 silent nights. His hands tangled in her hair, his fingers gripping her as if he feared she might dissolve into thin air. It was not gentle or tender. It was a desperate transfer of pain, a plea for her to take some of his unbearable burden. And Ilara met him there, in that chaotic, beautiful violence. She surrendered completely, not just her body, but the carefully guarded idealism of her heart. This was the intimacy she had waited for. Not a gentle symphony, but a crashing, soul-altering storm. In his desperate kiss, she felt a homecoming. When the kiss finally broke, they were both breathless, foreheads pressed together. The immense silence of the penthouse now filled with the sound of their ragged, shared breathing. He didn't let her go. His hands slid down to frame her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks as if to assure himself she was real. "Ilara," he whispered, her name a broken, reverent sound on his lips. It was the first time he had said it with anything other than professional detachment. It was a prayer. The armor was gone, leaving only the man, stripped bare of his power, his wealth, his reputation. In its place was a vulnerability so profound, so absolute, that it brought tears to her eyes. She had reached through the ice and touched the fire of his grief, and he had not burned her. The rules of their world had been irrevocably rewritten. She was no longer the help, and he was no longer the master of this gilded cage. They were survivors, 2 solitary souls who had found a fragile, desperate sanctuary in each other. He looked at her, truly saw her, and his eyes, once so cold and distant, now held a universe of terrifying, beautiful emotion. She had seen the man behind the myth, the heart inside the ghost, and in doing so, had offered him a salvation he never believed he deserved. The act of transgression was complete, a boundary shattered not for passion alone, but for a love born from the deepest, most compassionate kind of understanding. Everything had changed, and the cost of this moment was a reckoning that had yet to come. The dawn that followed their collision was brutally silent. Ilara awoke to the cold, sterile perfection of the guest room, the memory of his desperate kiss a phantom heat on her lips, a stark contrast to the chilled air. She listened for a sound, any sign of his presence, the soft click of a door, the low hum of the coffee machine, but the penthouse was a tomb. He was gone, vanished into the pre-dawn city without a word, leaving behind only the ghost of their encounter. The immense space, which had for a moment held the possibility of a shared future, now felt like a vast, echoing monument to her transgression. She walked through the living area, the marble cool beneath her bare feet, her reflection a solitary, fragile figure in the floor-to-ceiling glass. The intimacy that had shattered the night felt like a fever dream, and the stark, empty reality of the morning felt like a judgment already past. He returned that evening not as the man who had surrendered in her arms, but as the formidable Julian Blackwood, CEO and grieving widower. The armor was back in place, freshly polished, and more impenetrable than ever before. He moved through the rooms with a chilling, remote efficiency, his gaze sliding past her, as if she were a piece of furniture he no longer found interesting. When he spoke, it was only about Leo's schedule, his voice a flat, emotionless monotone that meticulously rebuilt the walls between them. Every clipped word, every deliberately averted glance, was a small, sharp act of rejection. Ilara felt each one like a physical blow, a calculated punishment designed to erase the vulnerability they had shared. He was not just retreating, he was performing a brutal systematic amputation of the connection she had so carefully nurtured, cutting her out of his world to save himself from the hope she represented. Adrift in a sea of confusion and profound hurt, Ilara struggled to reconcile the two Julians. The man who had kissed her with the raw, desperate hunger of a starving man seemed to have no relation to the icy automaton, who now occupied the same space. A war raged within her. The fierce, undeniable desire she felt for him battled a rising tide of guilt and shame. Had she misread a moment of weakness as something more? Had she, as his in-laws would surely claim, taken advantage of his profound vulnerability? His suffocating silence was an answer she refused to accept, yet it was the only one he offered. She replayed the kiss, the feel of his hands in her hair, the broken sound of her name on his lips, searching for a flaw in the memory. But she found only the undeniable truth of their shared desperation, a truth he was now determined to bury. Her heart, so carefully guarded and finally offered, felt as if it had been left on a cold, empty altar. The consequence, when it arrived, was not a shouted word or a tearful confession, but a crisp, cream-colored envelope delivered by a silent courier. It was from his in-laws' legal team. Julian summoned her to his office, placing the letter on the polished expanse of his desk, the space between them suddenly a battlefield. It was a formal notice, a declaration of war. They were filing for full custody of Leo, citing an unstable and inappropriate home environment, with her presence listed as the primary exhibit. The legal jargon was clinical and cruel, twisting her genuine care into something predatory and sinister. Ilara watched Julian's face as he explained the document, his expression a mask of controlled detachment, but she saw the pure, unadulterated terror flickering deep within his storm-gray eyes. The fragile world they had built in the quiet of the night had been dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of a courtroom. He presented the solution with the cold, brutal logic of a corporate strategist mapping out a hostile takeover. "You have to leave, Ilara." The 5 words were spoken quietly, but they landed with the devastating force of a physical blow shattering the last of her fragile hope. He outlined the plan his lawyers had devised: her immediate termination, a non-disclosure agreement, and a severance package so generous it was insulting. It was the only way, he explained, to neutralize their claims, to prove to the court that she was nothing more than an employee whose contract had ended. He laid out the strategy point by point, his voice steady and remote, never once meeting her eyes, never once acknowledging the emotional holocaust he was describing. To save his son, he had to sacrifice the one person who had seen his soul, and he performed the execution with a surgeon's chilling precision. With a final, devastating formality, he slid the papers across the desk. The termination agreement sat beside a check for a sum that made her feel physically ill. It was payment for her silence, for her complete and total erasure from their lives. "This will secure your future," he stated, his voice a hollow echo in the silent room. His gaze was fixed on a point just over her shoulder, his jaw so tight she could see the muscles clenching and unclenching beneath the skin. The agony was there, a caged beast rattling the bars of his self-control, but he refused to let it escape. He was forcing himself to become the monster his in-laws accused him of being, believing it was the only way to be the father his son needed. Ilara felt the floor drop away, leaving her in a free fall of shock and heartbreak. A strange, cold clarity cut through the fog of her pain. She looked at the check, a financial value placed on her heart. She looked at the legal document that would reduce their profound, life-altering connection to a mere business transaction. With a steady hand, she pushed both back across the desk toward him. "I don't want your money, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but imbued with a strength that surprised them both. "I was here because I care about Leo, and because I care about you. That was never for sale." She stood, her dignity a sudden impenetrable shield against his forced coldness. Without another word, she turned and walked out of his office, through the cavernous living room and out of the penthouse, leaving the fortune and the lies on his desk. She left with nothing but the worn coat on her back and the devastating, empowering knowledge of her own worth. After she was gone, the silence that descended upon the penthouse was absolute and suffocating. Julian remained in his office, staring at the unsigned papers on his desk, a testament to her integrity and his own profound failure. He walked to the living room window, to the exact spot where he had kissed her, and the emptiness of the vast room was a physical presence, a gaping wound in the heart of his home. He had won. He had protected his son. But he had done so by extinguishing the only light that had pierced his long darkness. The loneliness that washed over him was more complete, more desolate than anything he had felt, even in the raw aftermath of his wife's death. He had been given a second chance at feeling something real, and he had methodically, rationally destroyed it with his own two hands. The victory tasted exactly like ash. Ilara returned to her tiny fourth-floor walk-up, the air thick with the familiar smell of old books and her neighbor's cooking. The space that had once felt like a prison now felt like a refuge, a quiet corner of the world that was wholly and completely hers. The grief was a constant physical ache in her chest. She mourned the loss of Leo, his silent companionship, the weight of his small hand in hers. She mourned the loss of Julian, the broken, beautiful man she had allowed herself to love with a terrifying totality. But beneath the layers of sorrow, a new and unfamiliar feeling began to take root. Resilience. She had faced a billionaire's power, a family's venom, and her own deepest fears, and she had walked away, not broken, not defeated, but whole. Her heart, though shattered, was still her own. Days later, as she unpacked the small box of personal items she'd brought back from the penthouse, a folded piece of paper fluttered from the pages of a textbook. It was a crayon drawing from Leo, one she hadn't seen before. It showed the same three figures as the first, the boy, the woman, the tall man. But this time, the woman and the man were holding hands. And tucked into the pocket of the man's stick-figure suit was a tiny, bright red heart. It was a message from a silent child, a testament to the family he saw, the love he felt. Tears streamed down Ilara's face, but they were not just tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound validation. It was real. She hadn't imagined it. Holding the small, precious drawing, she understood that this was not an ending. It was an awakening. She was no longer just a student or an employee. She was a woman who now knew the terrifying, unbreakable power of her own love. 3 months passed, a season turning from the brittle cold of her departure to the hesitant warmth of a new spring. Ilara had found a quiet rhythm in her solitude, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She finished her graduate thesis, her words on developmental trauma now imbued with a painful, first-hand authority. She poured her remaining energy into a volunteer position at a downtown youth center, finding solace in the chaotic, vibrant world of children who wore their hearts on their sleeves. She did not allow herself to search for his name in the news or wonder about the outcome of the custody battle. She built a wall around that part of her memory, not out of anger, but out of a profound need for self-preservation. She was learning to live in the world again, not as a woman waiting for a key, but as one who was slowly, painstakingly, forging her own. The city, however, had a long memory. One afternoon, while researching for a new project in the university library, his face appeared on her screen. It was a brief article in a financial journal, announcing Blackwood Holdings' new philanthropic arm, a foundation dedicated to funding art therapy programs in underserved communities. The article was accompanied by a rare photograph of him, not in a boardroom, but at the opening of a children's art center. He looked different, thinner, perhaps, the sharp edges of his face softened by a weariness that went beyond fatigue, but it was his eyes that held her captive. The storm was still there, but the chilling ice had thawed, replaced by a quiet, lingering sorrow. Staring at the image, she felt the ghost of his kiss on her lips, a sudden, sharp ache that was both memory and premonition. A week later, a simple, unadorned black box arrived at her apartment, delivered by a courier who simply asked for her signature and then vanished. It bore no return address, but she knew. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing. For a full hour, she simply stared at it. The object, an alien artifact of a life she had tried to forget, sitting on the worn wood of her small kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she finally lifted the lid. The air filled with the familiar, achingly expensive scent of his world, a subtle mix of leather, paper, and something that smelled like winter rain. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was not a jewel or a check, but a single, beautifully bound sketchbook with a set of artist-grade charcoal pencils. It was a message in a language only they understood. Beneath the sketchbook was a small, worn stuffed bear with one button eye, the one Leo had clutched so fiercely in the weeks after his mother's death. He had never let it go. Alara lifted the bear, its familiar weight a solid, tangible piece of her past in her hands. She pressed it to her face, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of a little boy's sleep and a life she had been forced to abandon. It was an offering of impossible trust, a surrender of the most precious thing in his life into her care. Julian wasn't trying to buy her forgiveness or her silence. He was showing her, with these carefully chosen, deeply personal totems, that he remembered. He remembered her empathy, her understanding, her belief in the healing power of creation. He was acknowledging the truth of who she was, a truth he had been forced to deny. Tucked into the first page of the sketchbook was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored cardstock, folded in half. It was his personal stationery, the kind he used for thoughts he never intended for others to see. Her fingers shook as she opened it. There were only 5 words, written in his sharp, decisive handwriting, a script that seemed at odds with the profound vulnerability of the message itself. The house is quiet without you. It was not an apology, not a plea, not a promise. It was a simple, devastating confession. It was the truth of his loneliness, an admission that the fortress he had built to protect his son was now just a cage. A single, hot tear fell onto the card, blurring the ink, a testament to the fact that her carefully constructed walls had just been leveled by the quietest of words. She walked to her window, the note clutched in one hand, the small bear in the other, and looked out at the sprawling city. It no longer seemed like an indifferent beast, but a landscape of a million stories, a million fragile connections waiting to be made. The silence in his house was an echo of the silence that had once filled her own heart. She understood now that true intimacy wasn't about avoiding the storm, but about finding the one person you were willing to walk through it with. The future was a terrifying, beautiful unknown, but for the first time she felt ready to face it. The story of whether she would return, of whether 2 broken souls could truly build a home together, was just beginning. If you want to be part of their journey and believe in a love that mends the deepest wounds, I invite you to subscribe, share, and comment with your hopes for their future.